All right, get ready to dive into a philosophical mystery that has really puzzled thinkers for centuries, like literally centuries. We're going to be talking about consciousness, but not in the way you might expect. So get ready to explore the world of philosophical zombies.
And no, we're not talking about the flesh-eating kind you see in movies, nothing like that.
Right, definitely not.
Philosophical zombies or P-zombies are, well, a lot less gruesome, that's for sure, but a lot more mind-boggling.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So we're tackling this question of, is consciousness something extra, beyond just like the physical stuff of our brains?
Right.
Are we more than just complex machines, or could there be, a universe where beings act exactly like us, but lack any kind of inner experience?
Right. That's what we're diving into today. And, you shared that article with us by Suzi Travis, The P-Zombie Argument, and some really interesting comments. And people definitely have some strong opinions about whether or not these P-zombies are even conceivable in the first place.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating debate. So let's start with the basics. What exactly is a P-zombie? Paint us a picture.
Okay. So imagine a being that is physically indistinguishable from you or me.
Okay.
They look, act, speak, react, everything's exactly the same. But there's one crucial difference. They don't experience anything internally. So no thoughts, no feelings, no sensation of what it's like to be them.
So it's like a perfect imitation, but with this void inside.
Yeah.
So if you were to, say, step on a P-zombie's toe.
They would probably react just as you or I would. They might even yell, ouch, but they wouldn't actually feel any pain. Because there's no subjective experience of pain, because there's no conscious mind there to experience it.
Okay, that's where my brain starts to melt a little bit. If they're physically identical, how can we even say this lack of consciousness makes any difference?
Oh.
It seems like we're arguing about something we could never even test.
Right, and that's the big thing about the P-zombie argument, right? It really hinges on this idea of conceivability, that just because we can't directly observe something doesn't mean that it's not philosophically significant.
So when philosophers are talking about something being conceivable, what do they actually mean?
They're asking, can we imagine it without running into any logical contradictions?
Okay.
So, for example, we can imagine a giant hamster running on a wheel to power a city. Even though it's physically impossible, there's no logical contradiction there. But we can't imagine a square circle, right?
Right.
That's a contradiction. So the P-zombie argument really hinges on whether or not we can imagine these beings without any logical contradictions.
And if we can imagine it, then what? What does that tell us?
Well, that's where David Chalmers comes in. He argues that if we can imagine P-zombies clearly, consistently, and without hitting any kind of logical roadblock, then it suggests that consciousness might not just be a product of our physical brains.
So it implies there might be more to us than just meat and electricity.
Right.
That maybe those subjective experiences, what it feels like to be alive, isn't just a side effect of all the physical processes.
Exactly. And that's a pretty big deal in the world of philosophy of mind, where this whole idea of consciousness is a hard problem. It challenges that idea that we can fully explain the mind using only physical terms. But of course, not everyone buys into the P-zombie argument. There are some pretty compelling counterarguments that we should probably unpack.
Yeah, I mean, just looking through the comments on Susie's article, it definitely seems like not everyone is totally on board with this P-zombie idea. So let's dive into some of those counter-arguments. What are some of the main objections people raise against this whole P-zombie thing?
Well, I think one of the biggest criticisms you'll hear is that maybe, just maybe, P-zombies aren't really conceivable in the first place. I mean, sure, we can picture a being that looks and acts like a human. But how can we be absolutely sure that we're not, without even realizing it, smuggling in some element of consciousness when we imagine them like reacting to pain or navigating a social situation?
So, like, our intuition about P-zombies is flawed.
Yeah, maybe.
Maybe there is a contradiction in there, we just haven't found it yet.
Exactly. It could be that as we learn more about how consciousness actually works in the brain, the nuts and bolts of it, we'll uncover some fundamental reason why a P-zombie, as it's defined, is logically impossible. Maybe consciousness isn't this separate thing that you can just kind of remove, but rather an emergent property of a certain level of physical complexity.
Okay.
It's like thinking about fire. You can't have fire without heat, right?
Right.
And you can't have heat without some physical process generating it.
Right. It reminds me of that analogy she used in the article, too, about the speed zombie.
Right, yeah.
Where it's like we can kind of picture being identical to us, but twice as fast. But then you realize, well, speed is directly tied to physical limitations.
Yeah.
You can't really change one without the other. So that's kind of what they mean by contradiction.
Exactly. And some philosophers would say that consciousness might work the same way. Our ability to imagine separating it from our physical body might be a limit of our current understanding, not a reflection of a genuine possibility.
So it's like saying, just because we haven't figured out how to build a perpetual motion machine doesn't mean it's not physically impossible.
Yeah.
It's just we might think we can conceive of it until we understand the laws of thermodynamics better or something like that.
Exactly. And that kind of leads us to another really interesting counterpoint that I saw raised by some commenters, and that's this idea of reverse conceivability.
Okay, I think I'm going to need some help with that one. What is reverse conceivability and how does it play into all of this?
So the reverse conceivability argument basically flips the script.
Okay.
It suggests that the very fact that many people struggle to imagine a P-zombie, they find it counterintuitive or even impossible to fully grasp, might actually be evidence in favor of consciousness being inherently physical.
Oh, that's a really interesting twist. So instead of saying because we can conceive of it, it might be possible, it's saying because we can't conceive of it, it might be impossible, or at least less likely.
Exactly. Because if consciousness were truly separate from the physical body, shouldn't we be able to conceive of that separation more easily? The fact that it's such a brain-bending concept for so many people might suggest that it goes against the very nature of how consciousness and physicality are intertwined.
Okay. So that's a really compelling point.
Hmm.
But where does that leave us?
Hmm.
It seems like we're kind of stuck in a philosophical stalemate here.
Well, not necessarily. Even if we accept that P-zombies are conceivable, at least for the sake of argument, there's another major hurdle the P-zombie argument has to overcome. And that is, can we truly trust our imagination to tell us what's possible, especially when it comes to something as complex as consciousness?
That's true. Sometimes my imagination runs a little wild, and I don't know if I'd want to base a whole philosophical theory on it.
Exactly. And I think this objection really gets at the limitations of our own intuition and the very nature of scientific discovery. Just because we can't currently explain something doesn't mean there isn't an explanation waiting to be discovered.
Right, so we can't currently pinpoint the consciousness neurons in the brain, but that doesn't mean they're not there, right?
Right.
Maybe our understanding of the brain just isn't advanced enough yet.
That's a key point. Suzi actually uses a really great example in her article, water. Imagine trying to explain water to someone a few centuries ago. They might find it perfectly conceivable to imagine water without oxygen.
Until, of course, science came along and was like, nope, H2O. And suddenly our whole intuition was proven wrong, not because water without oxygen is conceivable, but because our understanding of water was incomplete.
Precisely. It's like assuming a book is written in a language we don't understand just because we can't read it yet.
Okay.
Our knowledge might be incomplete, but that doesn't mean the information isn't there, encoded in the very structure of the physical world.
So are the people who argue against P-zombies suggesting we're in a similar situation when it comes to consciousness?
Potentially, yeah.
That we haven't unlocked those secrets of the brain enough to rule out the possibility that it really is just a product of those physical processes?
That's one way to look at it. They might say we're caught in what philosophers call an epistemic gap.
An epistemic gap. Okay, I'm going to need you to explain that one.
Okay, great question. An epistemic gap just refers to a gap in our current knowledge. It's something we don't know yet. So it's about the limits of what we currently understand, not necessarily about what's fundamentally impossible.
So it's like the difference between not knowing how to speak French and it being inherently impossible for humans to speak French.
Exactly.
One is a gap in our knowledge. The other is a fundamental limitation.
Exactly. So those who argue against the P-zombie argument often say that we simply haven't bridged that epistemic gap when it comes to consciousness. Maybe with more research, a deeper understanding of the brain, we'll discover that what seems inconceivable now, this being physically identical to us but lacking any subjective experience, is actually impossible.
Okay, so I'm starting to see how this P-zombie debate really hinges on what we think we know about consciousness. But I'm guessing the pro-P-zombie folks have a response to that, right?
Oh, absolutely.
They're not just going to lie down and admit defeat
Mm-hmm.
because of an epistemic gap.
Of course not. They've got some strong arguments to make, and this is where it gets even more meta.
Okay.
They might argue that even if, down the line, future discoveries reveal the specific mechanisms of consciousness in the brain, like we figure out the how of it,
Right.
that still wouldn't bridge this gap between the objective physical world and the subjective first-person experience of being conscious.
Okay.
So it's like they would say, knowing the mechanics of how a clock works doesn't tell you what time feels like.
Right. So they're saying, yeah, you can map out every neuron and synapse involved in consciousness, but you still haven't captured the essence of what it feels like to have those experiences.
Right. And that leads us to another major objection, one that actually dives into the very logic of the p-zombie argument itself.
Okay.
But I think we need to give that one a segment of its own because it gets a little complex.
All right, you've definitely piqued my curiosity. Let's unpack that final counterargument and see if we can finally reach a verdict on the p-zombie debate. All right, so we've explored this p-zombie argument. We've gone through some pretty major counterarguments. So what is this final objection that you said kind of throws a wrench into the whole thing?
Okay, so this last one really gets into the nitty-gritty of how Davy Chalmers actually structures his argument. Remember, he uses P to represent all of the physical facts about our universe, and Q to represent, like, a specific subjective experience.
Yeah, it's like philosophical code for consciousness. But I gotta say, my brain starts to get a little fuzzy when we get into the X's and Y's of like the actual philosophical arguments. So is there a way we can maybe break that down with an example that's a little easier to wrap our heads around?
Absolutely. So instead of seeing red, let's use, let's say, the experience of feeling happy.
Okay.
So P would include all of those physical facts that we associate with happiness. So smiling, laughing, maybe even those little bursts of activity we can see in certain parts of the brain when someone says they feel happy.
Right.
And Q would represent the actual subjective feeling of happiness.
Okay, that makes sense. So how does Chalmers use this P and Q stuff to actually talk about P zombies?
Well, he defines a P-zombie world as P and Q. So it's a world physically identical to ours. That's the P part. But lacking that specific subjective experience of Q, which in this case is the feeling of happiness. So you might have a P-zombie that smiles and laughs at a joke, but they don't actually feel happy.
Okay, so far so good.
Yeah.
But I sense a but coming, so where's the flaw in that logic?
Well, critics of the P-zombie argument would say that by defining it this way as P and Q, Chalmers has already assumed that Q, the feeling of happiness, is something non-physical.
Ah, okay. I think I see where you're going with this.
Yeah.
Because if removing Q doesn't actually change any of the physical facts, P, then Q must be something else entirely.
Right.
It's like saying, picture a world exactly like ours, but without magical unicorns. You haven't really proven anything about the existence or non-existence of unicorns. You've just defined them as something separate from our existing world.
That's a great way to put it. And that's really the crux of this final objection, right? Critics would say that the P-zombie argument, at least in the way that Chalmers presents it, might be circular. It kind of assumes from the outset that subjective experience is this thing that's separate from the physical world rather than actually proving it.
So where does that leave us? I mean, we've gone on this whole deep dive into this P-zombie argument. Do we have any clearer answers about the nature of consciousness? Or have we just stumbled into a philosophical black hole?
Well, I don't know if we have any definitive answers, but I think we've definitely encountered some thought-provoking questions. You know, the P-zombie argument, even with its potential flaws, it really forces us to confront the limits of our own understanding. It highlights just how mysterious and complex this thing we call consciousness really is.
Yeah, for sure. It reminds us that there are still big questions out there, mysteries that maybe science and philosophy haven't fully unraveled yet. But before we wrap up, anything from those reader comments that stood out to you? Anything that kind of sparked a new thought, a different perspective on this whole debate?
You know what? One commenter, Ragged Clown, brought up a really interesting point about evolution, and they wondered if maybe we've overestimated the role of consciousness in our lives.
Like we're not as conscious as we like to think we are.
Exactly. Could it be that some aspects of our behavior, even our experiences, things that we often attribute to our conscious minds, are actually driven by, simpler, almost zombie-like processes that have evolved over millions of years? Processes that don't actually require this sort of magical ingredient of subjective experience.
Ooh, that's a fascinating and slightly unsettling thought. Are you suggesting that parts of our brain might be operating on autopilot, so to speak, carrying out all these complex actions, reactions, without any real conscious awareness?
It's definitely a question worth considering, right? And I think this whole deep dive into the P-zombie argument, it really forces us to confront our assumptions about who we are, how our minds work, and maybe, just maybe, it opens the door to exploring different models of consciousness, models that maybe move beyond this simple dichotomy of conscious versus unconscious.
Well, I think you've definitely given us all plenty to ponder today. And, who knows? Maybe one day we'll have that definitive answer to the question of consciousness. But until then, I say keep those brains buzzing. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. It's been a wild ride, as always. And remember, keep an eye on those around you. You never know who might be secretly harboring a zombie brain.